Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Rose Tinted Ceilings podcast. Today we have a special guest with us. Samantha, do you want to introduce yourself for us?
Sure. My name is Samantha Winterberg. I am a health psychologist. I also have my doctorate in education. I'm an author as well. And I spend a lot of time trying to work with individuals who are trying to navigate the challenges of life, and in particular, some of the tensions that we have in our contemporary culture.
Mhm. Now, immediately, I already have a question for you there. You said the word health psychologist. What does that mean? Is that like a different type of psychology? Like, can you tell us about that?
Sure, sure. Well, psychology actually has a lot of different disciplines. And so you might have heard things like organizational psychology or clinical psychology or maybe child psychology. So health psychology is really unique because the way that we are trained and educated is that we recognize that the body is holistic. So we're not just really working like with the head up. We're working as the entire body's integrated. And so the health of the entire body, of course, when we look at what the brain's actually part of our physical body. But when we talk about mental health, people think it's vastly different, but the brain's kind of controlling all the other functions of the body. So it's the whole entire body system.
Mhm. Did you have to like get trained separately to go into this like field of psychology, or was it just like in your training just for psychology in like general?
Yes, there's in school, like if you wanted to go to college for health psychology, you can do that. That's what I did. It's a
You also,
specialization.
Mhm. Okay. You also mentioned like getting educated in education too. Was that to like further your goals of psychology, or was that like a totally different thing you wanted to go into?
Well, that's a good question because I'm a few years older than you, and I would say that like early on, I did get my bachelor's in management, business management, and sociology, and I really always loved the social sciences. But there was like this push from my family to go back and go into business, which there's a lot of pressure on young girls, of course, as well. And we're going back a few years, but at the time, I really wanted to go and get my psychology degree. So I put that off for a while, but then I returned to it. So I went back to college, got my master's in psychology with a specialization in health psychology, went on and got my certifications, several of them in nutrition science as well, so I can incorporate that into my practice. And then I went ahead and got my doctorate in education so I could teach it.
Hmm. Now that you're like you've worked as a psychologist, what does that look like? So, what does that job actually entail? Like, walk us through a day.
Sure. Well, each day is going to be different and valuable. But right now, I work primarily with mostly queer people, although I do have clients who are not, but it's one of those things where over a number of years you build a practice through referral. And also a lot of my research and scholarship, the books I've written have been about queer equity. And so that kind of like draws in an attraction to what I do for that particular population. So generally I would have sessions just like you would go to see a therapist or a counselor. Often the people that I'm going to be working with have comorbidities. So that means that they might have two or three or more things going on that they might need help with. And it could be, a depression that's maybe impacting their digestive system, or the anxiety or stress that they're having, or panic attacks that they're having might be impacting their sleep and whatnot. So we work with that in the same kind of process that you would if you went to see a regular counselor. So a typical session.
So, what makes psychology and being a psychologist like different from being a counselor or a therapist? Could you like share some insight about the lines there?
Well, I think the biggest difference would be the specialization. For example, social workers, which is it's kind of this offshoot in a way of psychology, deals more with developing social service opportunities and looking outside into the community for wellness and support. Someone who is specializes in marriage and family therapy might be dealing with just specifically that population who might need some help. A licensed mental health counselor, for example, might be working specifically just with mental health. And so I think as we pay more attention to the mental health crisis in our country and the world, we're looking as ways to expand the disciplines of psychology. I mean, there's a lot of them. There's like psychedelic psychology, energy psychology now. There's just so many different factions of it. But that would really be, I'd say, like the difference of it.
Okay. Okay, that actually made sense. Thank you for that. And I'm also wondering, you said you've written a lot of books on this and done research on how
Mhm.
psychology is with queer people in specific. What drew you to that? Like, what made you want to go into that, like,
Yeah,
research?
that's a really great question. Well, I spent several years researching queer equity. So the difference between equity and equality is something that it's kind of a fine line, but there really is a difference. So if you don't know, I'd like to just share the difference because I think it's important for us to understand that equality is more about giving the same opportunity to everybody. Okay. So it would be the sameness. Where equity is looking at each individual person and assessing what their specific needs would be, and then distributing resources to them that would give everyone more of an equal chance at the end, right? So it's not giving everyone the same. And that's really important. So I wrote a book. In fact, here it is. The Queer Are Here and the Resource Manual. These are two books that I wrote recently and just had released this year, and then a series of workbooks. This is one of them for people who are really interested, like people that want to learn how to be inclusive, want to learn how overcome their biases, develop more emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and things like that. So that's what my books are geared towards. How I got into it was really just a matter of going through so much education and recognizing that our education system does not really represent equitably that particular population. So that would be a marginalized or what would be considered a minority population. And I just felt as though through my own personal experiences and a lot of the other people that I have spoken with and people that I've worked with in my practice, that there's a big piece missing of how queer people, LGBTQ plus individuals, are not only represented in curricula, but also in academic practices and policies and protections. And so I felt though a book looking at that specifically would be really beneficial. And that's why I wrote those books.
Okay, that's really nice. I wanted to ask about that too. Like, are queer perspectives like seen in psychology like at all? Like, is it getting better now? Are we seeing more like queer perspectives in like textbooks and studies, or are we still
Mhm.
kind of at that
Mhm.
place where everything's heteronormative?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of heteronormativity for sure. And I think that the attention, like this attention that I'm putting on and other scholars are putting on, the necessity to remove some of the stigma and the ignorance around what queer life is. And people don't recognize that people have had queer lifestyles forever. There's been queer people through since the beginning of time, and so it's not just like coming out, like people aren't coming out of the closet right now. More and more are, but there's a lot of reasons why that is. And so if you look at it from a psychological perspective, it's really not about um, how this has come about, how these people have come out or have decided to disclose their identities, as much as it is about, okay, I'm here now. I recognize who I am, or I'm confused about who I am, and I'd like to learn more about who I am. And these are the feelings, these are the things I'm struggling with mentally, in my mental health, some depression, anxiety, whatever. Like, I don't know how to come out comfortably. I don't know how to be okay with myself. I don't know how to talk with my family and my friends. I don't know how to handle my faith. There's a lot of issues that come up around queer life. And so, having a psychologist that can comfortably talk about that and help them navigate through that, I think is really beneficial.
Do you have any pieces of advice for anyone listening who might be a queer teenager who's dealing with those questions, who doesn't really know the next step? Like, what are some even like small things you could suggest for them?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of people who I think are in that position. Identity development occurs throughout early childhood and well into young adulthood. So a stable gender identity, for example, can occur before the ages of 3 or 4 years old. And then during adolescence, between like 12 and 18, a lot of teens begin to question, who am I? What do I believe about myself and the world around me? And start questioning their sexuality. Now, this might come as no surprise, but the onset of identity curiosity also can coincide with puberty, right? And the first sexual experiences for many young adults, not all, of course. So sexual identity can be fluid over your lifespan. My advice would be to recognize that whatever you feel about your gender and your sexuality is what's most important. So stay curious, stay true to yourself, stay informed, ask for help. There's actually a lot of great resources available if you're wanting to learn more about who you are and get a better understanding, and know that you're unique and that you're really important.
Oh, that's really lovely. And also, do you have any advice for those people who maybe aren't queer but want to make sure they are being equitable, that they are being welcoming? Like, what are some things we can do in
Mhm.
our day-to-day lives to make sure everyone around us is comfortable?
Right, that's a great question. Well, I think the most important thing is to kind of check ourselves. Um, we have biases, and those are called implicit biases, right? So those are things that we don't really recognize that we have. It might be a discrimination, a prejudice, a certain attitude or perspective that we have on something, and we don't really realize that that's coming from perhaps family, religion, social media, even politics, our school systems, our communities, right? So there's all of these structural influences that impact how we might develop attitudes. So I would say check yourself.
Mhm.
Ask a person. You know, if it's difficult for someone who is queer or who might be questioning and confused and not feeling safe, not to open up. And so if you feel someone is needing help, you can ask that. But I would ask silly, things, we've been talking about for years, like, how would you like to be referred? Or, what are your pronouns? What is your name? Do you prefer me to call you by your name?
Mhm.
Things like that that are just really welcoming. Let someone know, you're welcome here. You're safe here. You can open up, you can talk to me.
Mhm.
So a sense of belonging, I think, is probably the one thing that most queer people who are struggling are having a difficult
Mhm.
time finding, is that sense of community, of belonging. So if you can be that, kind individual, that would be helpful.
Something you just said stuck out to me, which is kind of the idea of implicit biases. Because, like, the idea that you could have bias and not know about it, it's kind of wild
Mhm,
to me. Because a lot of you think that if someone was being prejudiced, that they know. Now you're saying
mhm.
that, I'm like, how would we go about figuring out if we do have some implicit biases?
Okay, great question. And I'll tell you, there are some really wonderful studies and that were done on this. And so there's quizzes that you can take online for free, and just to check your bias. And there's many. You can check your bias about queer people. You can check your bias about ethnicity, whatever the case may be, and the implicit bias tests. So you can look online at those. I believe it's Berkeley Center, um, Science Center. They have a number of quizzes that you can go online and just check your biases. It's really interesting, and I definitely advise everyone to do it. It takes 5 minutes and it's
Mhm.
free. It really will give you some information on what maybe some of the perspectives are that you're holding, and these beliefs might not be your own, right? And then you can question, why do I believe that? Where did that belief come from? How is that
Mhm.
belief serving me? And if it doesn't, what can I do about that? How can I go
Mhm.
about changing that or creating a new belief system, that one
Mhm.
that's more inclusive? And that's really where the work is. It's like figuring out what we're doing, who we are, and if we want to be more inclusive and have a more pro-diverse attitude about life, and really, have a more humanistic attitude in life, then I think that we should know what our biases are,
Mhm.
and we often don't know. So that's one way you can find out.
Yeah, for sure. Earlier, you mentioned how a lot of implicit biases can come from like our school systems.
Mhm.
I was reading about that. Like, I think like school systems make like a big show saying like, "Hey, we're like diverse and we're equal to everyone." So, what are some ways that they are still being biased? Could you talk about that? I'm really curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, one of the biggest things right now is just the Louisiana court ruling to put the Ten Commandments back in schools. Now, I know that that's not specifically related to gender or sexuality, but the fact is, like, why in a country that has so many different religious and different faiths being practiced, why are we only putting the Ten Commandments in schools? Why are we banning books from schools? Why are we deciding that curricula that has anything to do with slavery, or really important historical events, why are those taken out of textbooks now? We need to really look at that, because that is what is creating, I think, more confusion. If we're not allowing our schools, our teachers, to share information about things that are part of history,
Mm-hmm.
how are we really benefiting our students? Right. So there's a lot of little practices that happen. But if you wanted to ask me about, socialized gender practices in schools, we know this right from the get-go. And I don't know if this was your experience, but when I was in school, we had a lot of gender differentiation, right? The boys lined up on one side, the girls on the other, tallest to shortest. If the boys were going to be encouraged to be doctors, for example, and the girls were encouraged to be nurses. The boys were encouraged to be pilots, and the girls were encouraged to be flight attendants. You see, so there's like a lot of gendering that goes on in schools and certainly in our families. Right, when a baby is in utero, even the way we talk to the baby is gendered. For example, if it's a boy, often you hear things like, oh, you're going to be rough and tough. You're going to play football. You're going to be a tough guy like your dad, right? And if it's a girl, you might hear people say things like, oh, you're going to be such a sweet princess. Daddy's pretty little girl. You're going to make such a great wife someday. You see how we gender? And even in these gender reveal parties, we're already gendering our children. And so I think that that is kind of oppressive. And I think that if we can get away from behaving that way, or just at least like recognizing that we're doing that, we are creating this labyrinth of confusion and discomfort, because not all children who are born are going to be born and then grow into those genders. We know this, right? There's a percentage of the population that is not the gender they were born into. And so how do we allow for that? If we continue to gender so specifically and so restrictly, how do we do that? How do we allow for them to develop the way that they really should?
Mhm. And I guess this question is kind of related to the implicit biases we talked a little bit about earlier.
Mhm.
But I think for sure, at least in my opinion, like I don't think I go around being like, oh, I'm like gendering things, I'm gendering things. But I can definitely see how that can be really easy to do, like subconsciously. You don't even mean to. I'm sure there are people who do it on accident who
Yeah.
don't want to. So what are some ways people are gendering things like that are so normal that no one even really notices that we should stop
Mhm.
doing.
Well, some of it's in our culture, right? So we grow up with saying things that we don't really realize are specifically gendered. Like if I said a word to you, tell me if you think what comes to mind, a female or a male. If I say teacher,
Female.
female, right? If I said surgeon,
Male.
right? Okay, so these are just already indoctrinated with their gender identity, these words.
Mm-hmm.
And and how is that possible, right? There's no, in English language, there's no uh, difference between, say, doctor is female and doctor is
Mm-hmm.
male. So we could say male lady or male man, right? We say male man. We say policeman, councilman,
Mm-hmm.
countryman, right? When you go to college, your first year, you're freshmen. Okay. So we gender our language. And so one of the ways that we can just be more aware of that is to think about what we're saying ahead of time. Now, language takes a long time to change. I'm not suggesting we change the English language, but I am suggesting that the way in which we speak and the way that we use gendered language can shift if we're just more aware of it.
Mm-hmm. That's super insightful. Thank you so much for sharing. And just to wrap us off, is there any like last little bit of knowledge, tips, anything you want to share with our audience?
Mhm. Well, I think just overall, I think for young women in particular, it's really important for you early on in your life to recognize the power that you have, the autonomy you have over your body, the dominion that you have over choices for your life. And, we're going to move forward if we recognize that we sort of create our physical reality. So we have a lot of personal power in what we do. Remember that you are important, that your life is important, that your life work is going to be important, and whatever you choose to do for your life and with your life is going to be a choice that you get to make. And so I just say, continue to embody energy and embody the fullness of who you are as a human.
Oh, that's so sweet. And you talked a little bit about your books during the episode, but do you want to shout out anything else, or do you want to just talk about that again, like anything you want to promote?
Well, my book is called The Queer Are Here, and essentially it's an academic textbook. So it's a research piece. It's not probably like an easy read, but it's for academics. It's really for leaders and people who work in academia and higher education specifically, so that they understand that the academic practices that we have are discriminating to some degree, and that they need to be examined more closely, that we need to have fairer representation for people who are LGBTQ, because it isn't just those 4 years. You're looking at the possibility of their economic advancement, of their wellness throughout the rest of their lives. So I think this is a really, really good book for people who are interested in learning more about the history of queer people, and also why it's so important that we look at the practices that we have in education. And then the resource manuals for educators. It's a really cool book. It's got a lot of like different activities and fun things for them to really incorporate that into their classrooms. So that's that. Yeah.
Well, that's so interesting. Definitely sounds intriguing. Thank you so much, Samantha, for taking the time and coming on to talk with us and talk with our audience. I'm sure there are a lot of takeaways. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
I'll stop.